churches, America's favourite place for redemption and sixth favourite place for chicken. Churches are a cornerstone of American life. There are roughly 350,000 congregations in the United States.
Joel Osteen is no stranger to televised sermons watched by millions, but one broadcast moment tied to John Oliver's explosive claims about televangelism sparked reactions that looked like a live TV meltdown. Comedian John Oliver pulled back the curtain on the world of prosperity gospel preachers, raising serious questions about wealth, influence, and the hidden systems behind modern megachurches. And as his investigation zeroed in on Joel Osteen, tensions rose around what was revealed. John Oliver targets Joel Osteen's world. Churches in America have long been seen as places of comfort, charity, and community. With hundreds of thousands of congregations spread across the country, many genuinely focus on helping people in need, offering food, shelter, and support during life's hardest moments. But as John Oliver pointed out in his investigation, not every ministry operates with the same intentions. Oliver opened his critique with a sharp reminder that faith-based institutions are often trusted without question. And that trust, he argued, can sometimes be used in ways that blur the line between spiritual guidance and financial exploitation. In his trademark style, he mixed humor with discomfort, pointing out how easily religious messaging can shift into something far more transactional. To illustrate how this pattern began, Oliver revisited the era of televangelism's most controversial figures. Names like Robert Tilton became symbols of excess during the 1980s, when televised sermons often looked more like live performances than religious teachings. Tilton's broadcasts were filled with dramatic declarations, emotional appeals, and claims of miraculous healings that blurred reality and performance. At times, his preaching became so extreme it bordered on surreal. From exaggerated prophecies to strange phrases and theatrical outbursts, Tilton's style turned faith into spectacle. Oliver used these moments not just for humor, but to highlight a deeper concern. When emotion becomes the product, belief can become the payment. But Oliver didn't treat this as a relic of the past. Instead, he drew a direct line from those early televangelists to today's most influential megachurch leaders, including Joel Osteen and figures like Kenneth Copeland. While the presentation may have evolved into smoother sermons and polished branding, Oliver argued that the underlying structure remains strikingly familiar. In his critique, Osteen became a central example of modern prosperity preaching, messages built around positivity, abundance, and the idea that faith can lead to material reward. According to Oliver, this creates a system where generosity is encouraged, but often with expectations attached. As the segment progressed, Oliver shifted from historical examples to modern reality, suggesting that the televangelist model didn't disappear, it simply upgraded. And that raises a much bigger question. If the system has changed so much on the surface, what parts of it have remained untouched underneath? That question sets the stage for a deeper look into how modern televangelism operates behind the scenes, and why figures like Joel Osteen continue to draw both massive support and intense criticism. How prosperity preachers turn faith into a high-end business. What once looked like a fading relic of flashy television preaching has, according to John Oliver, transformed into something far more powerful and far more profitable. Televangelism today is no longer confined to old recordings and outdated broadcasts. Instead, it has evolved into a global media machine supported by massive audiences and even bigger financial influence. Oliver pointed out that modern ministries are no longer small operations. They function more like corporations, complete with television networks, branding strategies, and international reach. Channels such as Trinity Broadcasting Network and Daystar have helped turn religious programming into a constant stream of content, blending faith with entertainment and fundraising on a massive scale. To show just how far this world can go, Oliver highlighted several controversial figures who embodied the extremes of prosperity preaching. One of the most striking examples came from Pastor Creflo Dollar, who once launched a campaign asking supporters to help fund a private jet worth $65 million. His justification was simple: global ministry required global transportation. But to many viewers, the request raised a very different question. Where does ministry end and luxury begin? That question becomes even more complicated when looking at Kenneth Copeland, another prominent televangelist often associated with wealth and opulence. Reports have shown that private jets are not only part of his ministry logistics, but also used for personal travel, including leisure trips and luxury destinations. These revelations added fuel to the growing criticism surrounding the prosperity gospel. Oliver used these examples to highlight a recurring pattern: the promise of spiritual reward tied directly to financial giving. In this belief system, donations are not just contributions, they are investments in divine return. The more you give, the more you are told you will receive, both spiritually and materially. Joel Osteen fits into this conversation not through scandal-driven headlines, but through influence and reach. With his massive Lakewood church audience and best-selling books, Osteen represents the polished, modern face of prosperity preaching. His message focuses on positivity and faith-driven success. But critics argue that it still aligns closely with the same system of expectation and reward. As Oliver connected these figures, a larger picture began to form. Whether through private jets, luxury homes, or global media empires, the structure behind prosperity preaching appears consistent: faith presented alongside financial encouragement. But what happens when belief itself becomes tied to money in ways that are hard to separate? And more importantly, who really benefits when generosity turns into obligation? The answer begins to emerge as Oliver digs even deeper into the mechanics of how this system persuades millions to keep giving. Inside the prosperity gospel formula that targets the vulnerable. At the center of John Oliver's investigation lies one of the most controversial ideas in modern televangelism: the belief that money given in faith will return multiplied blessings, often referred to as seed faith. This teaching frames donations as seeds planted into spiritual soil, expected to grow into financial or personal breakthroughs. On the surface, it sounds hopeful. It promises that generosity is never wasted and that every sacrifice will eventually be rewarded. But Oliver quickly peeled back the emotional framing and showed how this concept can shift from inspiration into pressure, especially when it is delivered to people already struggling. Across various televised sermons and promotional messages, viewers are encouraged to give increasingly specific amounts. In some cases, figures like $1,000 are presented not as suggestions, but as thresholds tied to divine outcomes. The message becomes less about voluntary giving and more about unlocking a promised future. According to Oliver's breakdown, this is where faith begins to blur with obligation. One of the most striking aspects of this system is how it adapts to financial hardship rather than easing it. Instead of discouraging struggling individuals from giving beyond their means, some messages explicitly suggest the opposite. Viewers are told that even if they are in debt or facing financial pressure, they should still sow their seed as an act of faith. The implication is clear: withholding money is framed as a barrier to blessing. Oliver highlighted even more extreme interpretations where audiences are encouraged to use credit cards or borrow money to fulfill their donations. In these cases, debt itself is reframed as an opportunity for divine intervention, with promises that faith will somehow resolve financial consequences later. The logic becomes circular: give what you don't have in order to receive what you need. To emphasize how surreal this becomes, Oliver compared the reasoning to believing that solving a serious problem could be achieved through an action that only makes it worse. The humor lands, but the concern underneath is serious. These messages are not being delivered in isolation. They are being broadcast to millions of viewers who may be vulnerable, desperate, or searching for hope. The emotional power behind these appeals is what makes the system so effective. By linking financial sacrifice to spiritual reward, televangelists create a structure where giving is no longer just encouraged, but emotionally reinforced. Every donation becomes a test of faith, and every hesitation becomes a perceived missed opportunity. Joel Osteen is often included within this broader framework, not necessarily through direct aggressive fundraising tactics, but through the language of abundance and expectation. His sermons frequently emphasize positivity, breakthrough, and prosperity as outcomes of faith. Critics argue that even without explicit pressure, the underlying message still supports the same cycle: give, believe, and receive. Oliver also brought attention to real-life consequences of this mindset, where individuals facing illness or financial distress prioritize donations over practical needs. These moments reveal how deeply the belief system can influence decision-making when hope becomes tied to financial action. As the investigation progresses, the focus shifts from teachings and messages to the people most affected by them. And what emerges next is far more disturbing than just persuasive preaching. It is the human cost behind the promises. Because once belief is monetized at this level, the question is no longer just what is being preached, but what is being sacrificed in the process. The hidden tax system that protects prosperity. Preachers. John Oliver then shifted his focus from preaching styles to something far less visible, but far more powerful: the financial system that allows religious organizations to grow massive wealth with minimal oversight. What he uncovered was not just about individual televangelists, but about the structure that makes their level of success possible in the first place. At the heart of his critique is a surprising reality. Religious organizations in the United States operate under some of the broadest tax exemptions in the entire system. To qualify as a church, there is no strict universal definition. Instead, the criteria are flexible enough that almost any group can be recognized if it presents itself as a faith-based organization. Oliver highlighted how vague the rules are, joking that even something as trivial as a shared belief system could technically qualify if framed correctly. Once an organization gains this status, the financial advantages become enormous. Churches are exempt from paying federal income tax, and in many cases, they benefit from additional protections such as housing allowances for leaders. This particular rule allows pastors to live in expensive homes without paying property taxes on them, a benefit known as the parsonage allowance. Oliver pointed to well-known televangelists as examples of how this system plays out in real life. Kenneth Copeland, for instance, has been associated with multi-million-dollar properties that fall under these exemptions. From the outside, these homes resemble luxury estates rather than traditional places of ministry, raising questions about how far the original intent of these laws has been stretched. What makes the situation even more striking is how little oversight exists. According to the data Oliver referenced, only a handful of churches are audited each year. So few that the chances of being investigated are extremely low. This lack of scrutiny creates an environment where financial activity can remain largely unchecked, even when large sums of money are involved. To bring the point home, Oliver emphasized how easy it is for institutions to operate within this framework while still maintaining religious legitimacy. The system is not necessarily designed for abuse, but its structure leaves wide openings that can be exploited by those who understand how it works. Joel Osteen's name appears again in this context, not because of direct financial misconduct claims in this segment, but because of what his ministry represents: a highly successful megachurch operating within the same legal and financial ecosystem. His global reach, best-selling books, and large-scale church operations demonstrate how profitable religious branding can become when combined with tax advantages and mass appeal. Oliver's investigation suggests that the issue is not limited to a few individuals, but rather a broader system that rewards scale, influence, and fundraising ability. The larger the ministry grows, the more financial flexibility it tends to gain, creating a cycle where success reinforces itself. And yet, the most unsettling part is how normal all of this appears on the surface. From outside, it looks like faith-based organization growth, but inside the structure, it functions more like a sophisticated financial machine operating with minimal resistance. But Oliver wasn't finished exposing how deep this system goes. Because if the rules are this loose and the oversight this limited, then the real question becomes, how far can someone push the system before anyone even notices? And to answer that, he decided to test the system himself in a way no one expected. John Oliver's bold move to test the limits of religious loopholes. At this stage of the investigation, John Oliver was no longer just analyzing the world of televangelism from a distance. The contradictions he had uncovered, the loopholes he had exposed, and the patterns he had traced all pointed to one unsettling conclusion: it might be too easy to become part of the system itself. Instead of continuing to simply comment on it, Oliver decided to test it directly. What if the rules governing religious organizations were not just vague in theory, but fully open to manipulation in practice? To find out, he and his team attempted something unexpected: creating their own church. The result was a satirical, yet legally recognized organization called Our Lady of Perpetual Exemption. While the name itself carried obvious humor, the structure behind it was surprisingly real. It was registered as a nonprofit religious entity, meaning it technically existed within the same framework as major ministries. What stood out immediately was how little resistance there was during the process. There was no deep theological review, no strict examination of belief systems, and no meaningful barrier preventing entry. Instead, the system relied on broad criteria that could be interpreted in multiple ways, depending on how they were presented. Even basic requirements, like having a place of worship, turned out to be flexible. In Oliver's case, the church operated out of a television production studio. Rather than being rejected outright, this setup still fit within acceptable parameters, as long as it was presented as a gathering space for a congregation. To complete the formal structure, the organization was registered in Texas, despite being produced in New York. This detail highlighted another layer of flexibility within the system. Geographic and administrative choices could be adjusted in ways that still satisfied official expectations. From there, the experiment became increasingly surreal. Instead of building a traditional doctrine, Oliver leaned into satire by encouraging reflection on how religious legitimacy itself is defined. Even this conceptual approach was enough to satisfy certain requirements for a belief system, revealing how loosely the rules could be interpreted. As the setup progressed, the distinction between satire and structure began to blur. What started as a comedic experiment was now functioning on paper as a legitimate religious organization, and that realization was exactly the point. To push the experiment further, Oliver introduced the idea to a live studio audience, inviting them to participate as members of the newly formed church. Their enthusiastic response turned the entire segment into something even more revealing. In moments, a group of spectators had effectively become a congregation, not through doctrine, but through suggestion and participation. That reaction raised a deeper, more uncomfortable question. If membership, belief, and structure can be formed so easily, what actually defines a real religious institution? Throughout the experiment, figures like Joel Osteen remained part of the broader conversation, representing large-scale ministries that already operate successfully within the same system. The contrast became impossible to ignore. If a satirical church could be created this effortlessly, then what does that say about organizations already managing millions of followers and massive financial flow? By the end of the experiment, Oliver had moved beyond critique. He had demonstrated something in real time: how fragile the boundaries really are between recognized religion and constructed belief systems. And just as the implications began to sink in, one final question emerged, even sharper than the rest. If the system can be entered this easily, who else might already be using it in ways no one has fully questioned yet? John Oliver's last word on faith, fortune, and power. By this point in his investigation, John Oliver brought everything back to the central issue that had been building from the very beginning: the prosperity gospel and the powerful figures who continue to promote it on a massive scale. What started as a look into televangelism had now become a wider critique of faith, wealth, and influence. Oliver's focus returned once again to well-known prosperity preachers, including Joel Osteen, whose global reach and polished messaging represent the modern face of megachurch Christianity. While Osteen is often associated with uplifting sermons and motivational language, critics argue that his message still aligns with the same underlying principle found throughout prosperity teaching: that faith and giving are directly connected to material reward. Alongside him, other figures like Creflo Dollar and Kenneth Copeland were used to illustrate how deeply financial influence is embedded in certain ministries. From private jets to luxury homes, Oliver highlighted how wealth accumulation has become intertwined with religious leadership in ways that continue to spark public debate. What made the critique even more powerful was not just the individual cases, but the pattern they formed together. Across different ministries and personalities, the same cycle appeared again and again: encourage giving, promise blessing, and sustain a system where generosity fuels expansion. Oliver's final point was not simply about exposing excess, but about questioning accountability. When faith becomes tied so closely to financial outcomes, it becomes difficult to separate genuine belief from structured persuasion. And as the segment closed, the underlying message was clear. This is no longer just about a few controversial pastors. It is about an entire system that continues to thrive, largely unchecked, in plain sight. And with that realization, the stage was set for the final question: how far can this system actually go before it finally breaks? Thanks for watching. What are your thoughts on John Oliver's expose on prosperity gospel televangelists? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more.